Thanks for joining us on The Agenda. I'm Bong Young-si. Revelations about North Korea's human rights abuses continue to shock the world whenever brought to light. To help us further our understanding about the issue, we have South Korea's Ambassador at Large for Human Rights, Lee Jung-hoon, joining us in the studio.
Human rights abuses in North Korea recently resurfaced as an important topic of discussion at the UN General Assembly. A draft resolution once again called on the Security Council to refer Pyongyang to the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, in effect pointing the finger at the North's leader, Kim Jong-un.
Series of summary executions in total disregard of due process and other international human rights standards, widely instituted practice of arbitrary detention.
North Korean defectors have been providing testimony about gross human rights violations taking place within the regime, calling on neighboring countries to halt the forced repatriation of escapees.
When I was 9 years old, I saw my friend's mother publicly executed. Her crime? Watching a Hollywood movie.
As stories about human rights atrocities continue to come to light, North Korea has also stepped up efforts to counter these claims. Pyongyang's Foreign Minister Ri Su-yong addressed the UN Human Rights Council, arguing the resolution based on quote-unquote false testimony should be nullified. But since 2005, the UN has continued to adopt a resolution without failure, reflecting steady support and interest from the international community. Just recently in Seoul, a conference on North Korean human rights took place, bringing prominent figures from different fields together to condemn egregious rights abuses ongoing in the North.
Not to put that report in the Palais Wilson in Geneva to gather dust, but to make sure that the world never forgets and always remembers the report of the Commission of Inquiry,
where millions of human beings are deprived of basic human rights, hostages of a communist dynasty. Taking this matter to the International Criminal Court is an obvious option.
As more people turn to the issue of reunification between the two Koreas with mounting hopes, rooting out human rights violations in the North is increasingly seen as an essential step in moving forward.
Welcome to the program, Ambassador Lee. We're extremely pleased to have you here since by any measures, you must be the most active and best known person when it comes to raising public effort to publicize the issues on the North Korean human rights violations. Could you tell us first what made you interested in this issue, North Korean human rights violations?
North Korean human rights issue is something that I've been involved in for over a decade. I have been involved with an NGO group that deals with the North Korean human rights, which is currently called the Save NK, Save North Korea. It's been doing its work for nearly a decade and a half, nearly 2 decades, and they were instrumental in petitioning to the United Nations that the North Korean defectors should be considered as refugees. And we actually had got signatures of over 10 million.
10 million?
Yeah, over 10 million signatures, which was a petition to the United Nations. So through those kind of involvement, and also I'm involved in publication of a magazine that deals a lot with North Korean issue and of course with the human rights issue. So those elements were considered when the current administration came in 2.5 years ago, and they asked me if I would be willing to do this. So this is something that I've been involved in the past, so I was very happy to do so.
Right, your career and the commitment are extremely impressive. How would you describe the Park GeunHye administration's unique approach to raising the international interest and awareness of human rights abuses inside North Korea? compared to the previous administration of South Korea?
Well, I think the current administration, especially President Park, last year, for example, she made an appearance at the United Nations General Assembly and made an appeal to the UN and the international community as a whole, speaking of the dire situation of the human rights condition and the atrocities that's going on in that country, and the need for the international community to come together to address the issue, because what's important is that we are aware of what's going on in that country, and she has done so, and that there must be reforms and improvements. And this is one of the conditions, one of the two very important conditions. One, of course, the human rights condition. Two, the North Korean nuclear program, which continues without being halted. So these are two conditions that must be dealt with first before we push ahead with a grand scale improvement in inter-Korean dialogue and inter-Korean relations as a whole. So she's been very principled, she's been very balanced, because she's also been very open arms in terms of humanitarian assistance. We continue to provide, and we're just waiting for North Korea to meet some of the minimum level of the request, not just by us, but by the international community, because the UN investigation on North Korean human rights, after 1 year of investigation, came up with a report that basically concluded that North Korea is committing crimes against humanity. This is a regime that we're dealing with. And we cannot deal with this regime as if nothing is happening in that country, right? We have to address it, and inter-Korean relations is fine. Dialogue, of course, very important, but at the same time, we have to tell them what is wrong. And I think in that sense, the current administration has been very balanced and also very principled in addressing both these issues.
Any success in helping improving the human rights situation in North Korea should be made not only by South Korea alone, but by cooperation in the international community. And I learned that you were the central figure in hosting the conference on North Korean human rights that recently took place in Seoul. What were the main topics of discussion in that conference?
Well, thank you for mentioning that. This took place on the 11th of November, so last week. The main focus, of course, is on North Korean human rights. It was very successful in a sense that probably, arguably, the largest turnout on North Korean Human Rights International Conference. Almost 500 people showed up at Chosun Hotel's Grand Ballroom. And I think it was very important in a sense that it's not just the usual suspects that came. Usual suspects are Michael Kirby, the COI Commission head, Marzuki Daruzman, the Special Rapporteur for North Korea of the United Nations, Sonia Biserko, Ambassador King of the US government, so on and so forth. But Jose Ramos Horta, the former president of East Timor and the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, he's normally not a North Korea but he's an iconic figure in the democratic campaign throughout the world. He came and gave a keynote speech. Martin Lee, the Hong Kong's Democratic Party founder, Baroness Buscombe of the British House of Lords, who's not dealt with she's mostly in media area and also human rights, but not necessarily North Korean human rights, but she came. The British ambassador in Korea also participated. So we had a very large number of people who were really in the pro-democracy world, but not really focusing on North Korean human rights, have come and shared the voices. We also addressed a number of the UN mechanisms and international legal prosecutory mechanisms that can bypass the International Criminal Court, because it looks like the Security Council is not going to refer the North Korean human rights issues to the International Criminal Court in Hague. So then, what now? Do we just wait until the Security Council does that? And everyone is saying that, no, we don't wait for that. There are other ways to deal with the prosecutory mechanism without having to resort to the ICC. So in that sense, substance-wise as well, it was very, very significant.
It seems to be a very clear reflection of enlarged international attention and effort. But at the same time, you mentioned the usual suspects and new suspects. But in order for international effort to be successful in changing the behavior of North Korea, then we have to also take into account the behavior of countries like China and Russia that happen to have a closer tie with North Korea and a very peculiar sense of sovereignty as opposed to human rights as universal values. So what would be the effective international effort to be made, in your opinion, to persuade countries like China and Russia? What lies ahead to help change behavior of these hesitant powers?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right in pointing out that it's mainly China and, of course, Russia who are the P5 members of the Security Council, and they hold the veto power in the Security Council, so they can just say no to any steps that we take. But I remain guardedly optimistic because last year, December 2014, despite the presence of China and Russia, North Korean human rights issue became an agenda in the Security Council upon recommendation by the General Assembly's resolution. So just the fact that it became an agenda for the very first time in history of the UN is something. Of course, to this date, China remains very hesitant, as you say, in making progress on this issue. But we have to remember that at the General Assembly, not to mention the third committee of the UN General Assembly, third committee of the UN General Assembly is the one that deals with the human rights issue. And every year, for over 10 years, the third committee has adopted resolutions, which has been followed up by the General Assembly. And last year, it was a very strong General Assembly resolution. This year, upon recommendation from the Special Rapporteur Darusman, the General Assembly will adopt, yet again, a very strong recommendation. So the pressure is there. And every year, the international community continued to tell the Chinese delegation that China should observe what is called the non-refoulement principle, which is that China should not be sending back the refugees back to North Korea, knowing that they will be persecuted. That's exactly what is happening. But China would not accept them as refugees, as you say, economic migrants, illegal aliens. Right. And they just round them up and send them back. Keep in mind that over 70% of the North Korean defectors are women.
70%.
Over 70%.
Over 70%.
This year, so far, it's over 80%. So the ones that are being persecuted are mostly women. So this is not just a Korean issue. This is not just a Korean peninsular issue. This is a women issue. It's a children's issue. There's trafficking, serious issues of trafficking, human trafficking. This is an international issue that must be addressed. And that's sort of, as we've done in the conference last week, and the more the international community addresses this issue, I think that China will eventually feel the pressure to change its stance, hopefully.
And there's one more country that seems to have been feeling pressure from the international community, which is North Korea. And it is quite interesting to me that North Korea used to be totally dismissive to international call for improving its human rights record. But in recent period, it seems like changing different attitude toward the international pressure. What do you think of the North Korea's recent response to international pressure on its human rights record?
Very interesting and also optimistic. There are 4 Security Council sanctions resolutions on North Korea. None of them have to do with human rights violations. 3 of them have to do with the North Korean nuclear tests, and 1 is on long-range missiles. So these are all sanctions resolutions. And yet North Korea would not budge. Nothing seems to touch them.
Okay.
And yet here's simply a resolution. Resolution is not, in terms of enforcement, not binding in any way. But the UN is addressing North Korean human rights violations. There's now this COI report that chronicles very vividly North Korean human rights violations from A to Z. And North Korea is responding like it's never responded before. You know that last year, before the General Assembly and the Security Council adopted the resolution, they actually extended invitation to Marzuki Daruzman, the Special Rapporteur for North Korea, but under the condition that they take out crimes against humanity part and also the prosecution part, because the report says that it recommends that those who are responsible for the atrocities should be prosecuted. Right. So if he's able to take those parts out of the resolution, that they would invite him to North Korea. Of course, he could not accept those conditions, and they, of course, canceled the invitation. For first time in 15 years, the North Korean foreign minister appeared at the UN and gave a speech last year. Right. This year, did the same thing again. They're sending their key diplomats, like Kang Seok-ju, to Europe to talk to them, saying that it's unfair, that there's no human rights violations in North Korea. There's no political prison camps. North Korea also came up with their own human rights record. They're blaming the United States for human rights violations. So, all in all, what we're saying is North Korea really feeling the pressure of the international community, scrutinizing, putting a focus on what's going on North Korea. Maybe it's embarrassed, and I think that's a good sign, because, and we have to keep the pressure on, because this is the only way that we're going to see some changes. We're not seeing changes as yet. All we're seeing is very, very significant response from North Korea. Now let's translate that to real changes and reforms so that there's some improvement in conditions of the human rights violations.
It's been reported that North Korea extended the invitation to Mr. Ban Ki-moon, United Nations Secretary General. And it's very interesting because in May, North Korea suddenly canceled the invitation, standing invitation for Secretary Ban Ki-moon to make a visit to Kaesong Industrial Complex. What do you make of this North Korea's move, inviting General Secretary Ban Ki-moon to North Korea?
I think it's the change in strategy from North Korea, from simply denying the human rights violations. I think it's taking a very aggressive position in addressing this issue. And as you say, yes, UN Secretary General is
one of the key figures in the world stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And if the current leader Kim Jong-un meets with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, they're probably thinking that this could actually help improve the image of Kim Jong-un, which the image that's quite frankly being ridiculed by the international community. So I think it is a strategy to get out of this image, and hoping that this will somehow maybe moderate whatever resolutions, actions taken by the United Nations on human rights and security and the nuclear issues, and maybe this leading to China finally saying that President Xi Jinping maybe inviting Kim Jong-un, because that's going to be very important for his leadership role in the domestic front within North Korea. So it's not just about Kim Jong-un and the outside world. It's about Kim Jong-un and inside of North Korea. Meeting with the head of the United Nations would help his position.
You've been diligently sending out the message on representing South Korean government on more effort needed to raise the human rights violation inside North Korea. Then is there any element of disappointment in you? Because in domestic politics, there has not been as much concerted effort, especially in the National Assembly, to put additional pressure on North Korean regime to improve its human rights record.
Well, I think you're spot on in terms of domestic politics. We have a problem with the National Assembly. We have the North Korean Human Rights Act, which has been held in abeyance for over 10 years.
Right.
The problem is, humanitarian issues are humanitarian issues. Even without this law, even without the North Korean Human Rights Act, we can at any time provide humanitarian assistance, and as we have done so. And yet, unfortunately, the opposition party is making this Human Rights Act as if, this is very political. And they're trying to somehow undercut the human rights portion and trying to supplant it with the humanitarian aspects, as if without this law, you cannot provide humanitarian assistance. That's the point, that you can, even without this law. So let's not keep trying to add on to something that you don't really need, because it's been,
You still have
we've been doing
way
that
of
all
doing
this time. Yeah,
important
they're
things.
very much against the, providing assistance to the NGO community that deals with North Korean human rights. So a lot of the Korean NGOs are getting funds from the United States, from European dimensions. We're just not getting, funding from within South Korea, and that's a shame, because we are at the end of the day doing this for our own people.
Right,
so.
right.
I'm very disappointed at our National Assembly. It doesn't look like it's going to be done this year. Hopefully, with the new National Assembly coming in next year, we'll be able to get this done in 2016.
Do you feel more hopeful about the United Nations Field Office on North Korean human rights now open in Seoul back in June? You mentioned that, citing the example of Germany, that location and opening of this UN Field Office on North Korean human rights will be very important in advancing the overall cause. What do you see in the near future?
Well, I think it's very important development, and I think it's one of the recommendations put forward by the COI report. It opened in June, as you say, and I think it will play a very important role going forward in continuing to chronicle records of the violations through their interviews with the witnesses, the defectors. I think it will have a psychological effect that the Salzgitter had, which is a similar office that was public records office, keeping track of the violations in East Germany. Before the unification of Germany, the East Germans, especially those who are, for example, shooting at some of the East Germans who are trying to exit East Germany. Now they're thinking twice. They're looking behind their shoulders. So they, this has a very important psychological effect in reducing the degree of violations in East Germany. So we're hoping that the setting up of the UN office in Seoul will have that kind of psychological effect on those perpetrators of human rights violations, that they are being watched, that their names are being recorded.
And President Park GeunHye declared that the effort to improve human rights conditions in North Korea are in parallel with the effort to prepare for the peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. But some people may be concerned that you are making too many different kinds of effort. It's better to concentrate your effort to achieve one thing at a time. So what's your opinion about combining your effort to address the human rights violation in North Korea and improving the effort in terms of keeping North Korea free of nuclear weapons and preparing for the peaceful unification between the two Koreas? Do you see any connections, correlation between improving the human rights condition in North Korea and preparing for the unification or addressing other security issues?
I think there's absolute correlation in addressing these issues. And I'm very glad that finally a Korean leader is showing the vision and goal, a very clear vision which is unification, not just in terms of rhetorical vision. And I think what the current government means by addressing human rights issues and linking that to the unification issue is that it's only logical that if there is genuine improvement in North Korean human rights condition, that basically suggests that there are changes in North Korea, that there has to be reforms. And once those changes take place, I think we can then genuinely think about a peaceful transition into a real unification mode.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Lee, for sharing your knowledge and experience on the issue of North Korean human rights violations and the international effort to address it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Upholding human rights in North Korea is not only a matter of universal values, but an imperative obstacle that South Korea must overcome to pave the way for a peaceful unification. This is why continuous support and interest from the global community will remain crucial in realizing these goals. I'm Bong Young-sik. Thanks for watching.